archaeological pit, or I'm not standing in a resort area if it's 400 years ago. I would be a soldier standing here at the very edge of the British Empire in 1610. And that is a dangerous place for anyone to ever have been standing. Now think about what happens 200 years later. The sun never set onto the British Empire. There's a British possession all over the globe. Every one of us on this tour has been affected by the British Empire. It grew so large that it affected the entire world. Where did it first grow and begin? Jamestown was its first successful overseas venture. And by the fort expanding this direction with your own eyes, you're actually seeing the growth of the British Empire, the first baby step. If you're from Hawaii, it affected you. If you're from Hong Kong, it affected you. If you're from South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Belize, it affected you. And here you are seeing it for the first time growing. These guys are learning how to get better at this whole colonization business. A lot of great things will happen, a lot of terrible things will happen because they came here. But you're seeing, actually through archaeology, these people are a lot smarter than we gave them credit for. We started out thinking, what a terrible place to live, and now we see the adaptation and the thriving and the success that it will later lead to, because it has changed the world. And we're learning to see that way. Okay, we're going to go inside the original fort and get some shade. So what we're going to do is go to the fence, take a left at the brick church house.
So this used to be a wooden church. This is where the House of Burgesses were formed for the first time, right in this area right here. This is history, people. There's Pocahontas.
So what does it say here?
Mary John Ralph.
These Native American artifacts have been found in English trap pits. What do you think that is? Arrow.
A triangle. Let's go back to 1994. Why is there going to be an archaeology project beginning here? Why did I took you here? Well, the first shovel went to the ground right about where you're standing over here. It's kind of like a game of Battleship. Where do you put your first peg? There's a strategy. Hopefully you hit something right away. But it isn't just a shot in the dark. You have to think about it. Where would you begin if you're Dr. Bill Kelso? Well, there were clues all along that told you the fort could still be here. And one of them we're standing next to. That church was built as a replica in 1907, but inside that replica stands the 1617 foundation of a wooden church that was here. Well, there was a fort here until 1630. So if that church is over here, the fort shouldn't be in the river, because that should be in the river. Number two, during the American Civil War, the Confederate Army was here. Ironically, they picked the exact same place to build a fort the English did and didn't realize it. They called it Fort Pocahontas. And they built earthwork forts, which you can see kind of sticking out in between the fence there, way in the distance. Now, those are the earthworks we're leaving alone, but they used to run through here. We had to take some down to do this archaeology. So when we told Civil War Trust we were going to do this, we said we will study Civil War earthwork construction for you. And we did. And we found a lot of 17th century artifacts in the 1861 earthwork. Now, Confederate officers mentioned several times that men were finding relics like armor from the 1600s during the American Civil War. That's clue number two. Clue number three, during the Great Depression. Remember the Great Depression, what's called the Civilian Conservation Corps. Both my grandfathers were in it. These are workers working for the government, doing construction work. Here, they're digging utility ditches, right where I'm pointing. And they're digging below the plow zone, so therefore they're finding a lot of artifacts. Those artifacts were already on display by the 1930s. They weren't working in the river. So if the fort's in the river, why are all the clues right here? That's why you put a 10 by 10 foot square and you rope it off. And Bill Kelso's first shovel goes in the ground right between the shed and that monument. And right away, you've got this dirt. Now, I already told you guys, well, they have this thing called plow zone. I guess you just throw that dirt away. You do not. You take that dirt, you put it on the screen. You put the screen on the wheelbarrow. And the dirt goes into the wheelbarrow. Artifacts, they go on the screen. Now, you might get the impression, well, those artifacts are out of context. They're not that valuable. And I would agree with you. Except that they're from the right time period. They encourage you to dig deeper. It's kind of like a clue that the treasure is still below you. Now, what was happening is, within the first few shovels of ground, the artifacts were actually from the late 1500s. The artifacts being found were older than Jamestown. That is not a bad thing. That is a great thing. Think about everything you're carrying right now in your hands or in your pockets. If you dropped everything on the ground today, and you're trying to prove, I live in 2015, then nothing you drop today can be manufactured in 2019. You may have a 10-year-old watch right now. You may have a 20-year-old wallet. You may even have an ancient phone from 2 years ago. Whatever you drop today cannot have been manufactured tomorrow. And so that's what archaeologists do. They find the latest date an artifact is found to help date where something is. And then when the artifacts are military in nature, you're really getting close. That's what happened the first few months in 1994. And then you work towards the river, because the real goal is to find a wall. And this is the first wall ever found. It's the one right to my right. This is Bill Kelso. This is what it looked like in 1994. And this wall was the wall right by the river. It looks a lot like the one we just saw. It's a stain in the ground that tells you how big the trench was. Dark stains that tell you where the wood rotted away. But in this photo, the stains are dug out 4 feet deep in the ground. It screams, I'm a military palisade wall. But is it English? How do you know it's from 1607 and not 1700? How do you know an English guy did it? Because of litter. You know how people say not to litter? But litter's great for archaeology. In fact, litter I call future archaeology. Think about it. Whatever you drop today on the ground is going to be something that they're going to really think is cool in 400 years. And this is an example. This bottle here, it's in the museum today. If you go to the Archaearium, you'll see it. It's called Surrey, Hampshire borderware. It's called Surrey, Hampshire borderware because those are the 2 English counties it was made. That's not what people called it back then. That's what curators call it. Because curators like to write like they write for the Williams-Sonoma catalog. Everything sounds fancy. This would have been a beer bottle. Somebody would have been drinking out of the beer bottle. They would have ditched the beer bottle near that cannon, and they would have been working on that fort wall. Because this is from the right time period, right social class, and right country to be someone working on that wall in 1607. This would be exactly the same thing as in 400 years. Someone rediscovers Interstate 64 by finding a brown bottle with a silver label called Coors Light, and some curator calls it Golden Colorado glassware. Puts it behind the glassware. As we laugh, remember, we proved just how normal these guys were. And my whole point of this course is to tell you one thing, and one thing more than anything else. Archaeology democratizes history. Because most of the time, museums buy things from auction houses because some earl or duke can't pay their taxes. So you go to the museum and, wow, everyone has silver bowls and plates and fancy paintings. Yeah, that's not true then, and that's not true now. How do most of us live? How do most of them live? Archaeology tells you that story. But it also tells you history. See, that's the first wall found. And no one knew whether that was the northern wall or the southern wall of the fort. You really didn't want it to be the northern wall of Jamestown. But the second wall was found going this direction, the one behind you. I'm going to argue that's the most important wall of all. By that wall being found going away from the river, then most of Jamestown is here. If that wall went the other direction, the tour is now over, we know nothing else. And we could have told you 20, 30, 40 years ago. This wall is going this way. The third wall, 2003, makes the triangle shape. The project was only funded for 10 years. As the money runs out, you find the original 3 walls. You find the borders of a puzzle. But how many of you like to build a puzzle and just walk away without finishing it? The middle of the puzzle has been worked on the last 10 years because the project continues to be funded. You're the ones who fund it. That is why we split your admission ticket in half. My job on this tour is to justify why you pay $7 out of $14 for this. It's the research that we all benefit from. And it's being sustained by you, the visitor. Now, let's tell you why that's important. So English guys came here, history book lesson, right? 104 men and boys came here across the ocean from England. So did they come here for freedom? I would argue yes. Not a kind of freedom you have in Plymouth that's a religious freedom, but more of a personal economic freedom. To make money, to make a profit. They're working for someone else, though, called the Virginia Company. I would call them the Virginia Corporation today. Major investors and stockholders are sending you over here to land you call Virginia that Spain called Florida del Norte. And that's dangerous. And so you have a charter signed by King James. The charter sets out the rules of settlement, the rules of engagement, and they don't follow all the rules. One of the rules they don't follow is don't settle on low-lying marshy ground, it will prove unhealthy. Ignored. Be not surprised as the French word Florida. This is a group that got ransacked near Jacksonville. Settle inland to avoid the Spanish. That's the one they follow. Because your first leader is named Edward Mariah Wingfield. He's 57. He's a captain. He's a veteran of fighting Spanish. He's afraid of the Spanish. He knows what they can do. So he chooses a spot against other people's wishes that is on an angle of the James River. You follow me real quick. I'm pointing it out to you right now. You may see a right angle from this cannon. Enemy ships trying to make that turn are going to get stuck. They're not going to be able to fire back while you're firing on them. From an army point of view, it's actually genius. Protected from the swamp, protected from the river, protected from the river. All three sides with cannon. Now, Wingfield is pretty happy with himself. And then the summer hits. This time of year hits. And out of 104 people, 38 survive by September.
Yep.
Men 19, 18 years old are dying. A man who's 57 is still alive. They think it's fishy, and they accuse him of hoarding supplies and kick him out of Jamestown. Then they kick out their second leader. I can tell you that leadership gets you killed more than bad water sometimes. So who's the third leader of Jamestown? The statue. Captain John Smith. Not 47 the way he looks in the statue, but 27 when he landed here. And he lands here under arrest for mutiny. Back to sailors. It's profound to have John Smith lead your fort now. If your average Jamestown colonist is someone well connected from London, someone who went to Oxford or Cambridge, someone who knows the king or knows an earl or a duke. But John Smith is from Willoughby, Lincolnshire, England. His hometown today has 1,400 people in it. Lincolnshire is the most rural county in England to this day. John Smith, for lack of a better phrase, is what we would call in America today a good old boy. He grew up on a farm. He didn't want to be a farmer. He left home at 18, became a soldier of fortune, was enslaved in Turkey, killed his slave master, escaped through the Ukraine. We're talking about Chuck Norris had he lived 400 years. But he's been wronged by many historians who consider him a liar because he brags a lot. You're talking about a man fighting against the English class system and he can't win that fight. So he's arrogant about it. But you can be arrogant and right at the same time. And I'm going to prove it by saying John Smith built this building. We rebuilt it. But John Smith said when he took over, he got rid of the tents along the wall here. He replaced it with a series of barracks. Let's go inside and see if he's right. So John Smith wrote about it, and many historians say John Smith exaggerates the truth. But here's the deal. The ground shows you stains that show you a wall here, a wall there, a wall there, and a wall there. Gaps in the walls tell you where the doors would be. This central stains tells you that was a fireplace, which means there's a room, and there's a room, and upstairs there's 2 more rooms. This is a 4-room cottage. In architecture, this style, this pattern is known as mud and stud architecture. We can presume it would have 1-foot thick mud walls and a ton of thatch on the roof. So why is it important? Is it truly John Smith's? It's inside the fort. It's where he said they built them. He said he built a series of them. We found 4. And this type of architecture. There are 37 of these buildings still standing in England to this day. And all 37 are found in Lincolnshire, where John Smith was from. The only other man from Lincolnshire is his head carpenter. Lincolnshire, in eastern Middle England. Lincolnshire, the rural county. John Smith's a good old boy. If he was an American today, who would he be? He might be from the heartland or the deep south. He's 27 years old. He's been in the military. People think of him as a young man, but he's done 4 tours in Afghanistan. He stopped being a young man a long time ago. He hates guys from the Pentagon. He hates guys from West Point. He hates guys from Harvard, Yale, New York, and LA. You may know John Smith today. I had an officer say he served with him in Iraq. John Smith is alive and well. He's the guy on the construction site making sure people work who hates the guy with a tie who comes in and tries to ask him what he's doing. This good old boy is a part of the American fabric. But I'm arguing so much about the American fabric comes from somewhere else. This idea of a man who is fighting against a class system, who's arrogant because he's trying to prove he's intelligent, but they don't want him to be intelligent, has been wronged because as he increasingly gets frustrated, his writings become more bizarre and inaccurate. But the earliest editions of his writings have been proven to be very accurate. And I'm going to argue this: why would you lie about building barracks? That's a boring thing to lie about. When we lie about things that are very political. If I said my neighbors are the cheapest people on the planet, well, they're not going to believe me when they read my email in 400 years. But if I said last Saturday I went to Home Depot and built a shed in my backyard, they will find the evidence of the shed in my backyard because we don't lie about that stuff. So when John Smith says, later on in his leadership, I repaired a church and a storehouse and a kitchen, those three buildings ought to be found in the same spot. And I'm going to take you right now to downtown Jamestown. What we're going to do is we're going to step foot in a place that's very hot and humid for this next 5 minutes. I will make it worth your while by saying, not only is it a top 10 discovery in the world, but you can stand where your country began. Then we're going to point out a couple things real quickly and get you in the shade. But I want to take you to the original church at Jamestown because it's one of the most important things we can talk about on any tour. We're going to walk inside where something very famous happened. It's right over there where the mud and walls are. And you can walk inside and stand there. We will tell you what happened on this very spot 401 years ago.
Happy Grace. Happy Grace.
Happy Grace. Where does everyone come from? Anyway, here. Something happened here that changed the world. But in order to understand what changed the world, we have to understand what this building was. And indeed, it was the first major church in Jamestown. That can't be it. It's made out of brick. The church tower's from 1680. The replica church is from 1907. And even the oldest church there was a wooden church in 1617. It would have been sticking out of the walls. Now the fort, as you saw earlier on the tour, was expanded, no problem. But they built a church before they ever made the fort bigger, which means their first church has to be here in the triangle. And it was found 4 to 5 years ago by looking at stains in the ground. One here and one here were the first two. But I told you it's very important to measure how far deep they go. And these stains, these poles were dug 5.5 feet deep, which tells you they're holding up heavy walls and a heavy roof. Another way to look at it, we left a trailer. This is a downtown building, just by depth, by the walls. And it's a big building. Every 12 feet was another pole. We measured this rectangle-shaped building, and it is 64 by 24 feet. It's very tall, it's very big, you see it from far away, and the main gate into Jamestown is where John Smith now stands. That sounds like where you would put a church, where everyone can see it, and everyone has to walk through it. And this is the first known Protestant church ever found in what's now the United States. That's a first. And the place I'm standing is very important, it's a chancel. Now if you're worried about me standing on anyone, there's nobody here right now. All 4 of these men have been removed, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But this indicates a church chancel. When I pass around the photograph of the church from 5 years ago, you're going to see some dark stains that indicate graves, holes filled in the sides of people. Now, a guy named William Strachey wrote about the church. He said our church was a pretty little chapel, 60 by 24 feet. And here we go, 64 by 24 feet, pretty close. Then you have the east end of the building with 4 graves. Now the English church is Protestant, but it has a lot of Catholic tradition compared to other Protestant churches. That's why you have Puritans who are angry about this. So you have the dominant Church of England here, the Anglican Church, carrying on a lot of customs, one of which was to bury prominent people in the church chancel.
Yep.
Now here's the thing, another way to look at it is the English class system doesn't even end when you die. Think about that kind of system. The highest ranking people get to be buried in the highest ranking place. That's why we got permission to uncover these graves. It should be very hard, and I want it to be very hard to uncover a grave. You wouldn't want somebody doing that to a relative for just any old purpose. We have to prove to people in Richmond and state government, why would you want to uncover a grave? Because we know who they are. We want to take them out of the ground because they're rich people who died in an 8-year period. It narrows it down significantly. Rich people are not better than poor people, but they do have better records. They get sued more. They have more property, have more better wills. They have a paper trail to lead them to people today that you can do DNA for. Now the 4 men have been worked on at the Smithsonian. And I will fess up and tell you that we can't tell you who they are until the July 28th. But do go to our website July 28th and do check out Smithsonian Magazine August edition. When you work with the Smithsonian, you must follow their rules. And remember, they would reach 100 times more people than we can. But I will say this, we probably have a minister, 2 captains, and a knight. We're going to tell the story of who's really in charge of Jamestown and some interesting things about religion, so stay tuned. But to make it worth your while, I will tell you what we do have the ability to tell you. Why this became a top 10 discovery in the world. It's because on this spot, 401 years ago, according to Sir Thomas Dale, the governor of Virginia, during the middle of a 5-year war called the Anglo-Powhatan War. You're no longer fighting or fearing the Spanish, you're fighting the Powhatan tribes. The English and the Powhatans are locked in a war that's pretty brutal on both sides, and neither's winning it. So how do you gain advantage over the Powhatans? You realize that Pocahontas, the favored daughter of Chief Powhatan, is in Northern Virginia with a tribe called the Potawatomis. And you make a deal with the Potawatomis that you can seize Pocahontas, and you hold her here as a hostage. She's no longer a 10-year-old girl skipping through this fort. She's now a 17-year-old young woman. And she's going to meet a man named John. Not John Smith, who she already knew. John Smith knew Pocahontas when she was 10 and he was 27. That's not a romance, but it makes a good Disney movie. The John she ends up marrying is named John Rolfe. He's 29. She's 17. John Rolfe is the tobacco planter who's making the tobacco that makes Jamestown stable and successful. He's a successful businessman. He's a very pious, Old Testament quoting businessman. Meaning he's from Eastern England, he quotes the Old Testament word for word. He's kind of what we would call a Puritan, an evangelical Anglican. And there are a few of them here, they're not all in New England. And Rolfe is upset. He wrote a 10-page letter where he says, I burn for Pocahontas, I love her, but I might burn for her. Now he's not cynical like your average guy at Jamestown. He's very earnest, very serious, very brooding. But when you read John Rolfe's letter, he says, I love Pocahontas, and he wrote a 10-page letter. Ladies, men don't write 10-page letters if they don't mean it.
It goes this way. Yeah, it goes that way.
So,
Well, there's
the
the.
man is pacing the floor, his humanity comes out, and he quotes Leviticus. That's very curious for an Anglican to do. But he says, I'm not allowed to marry a heathen woman until he sees she's converted to Christianity, given the name Rebecca. He sees that as a sign. Now he says, I'm going to marry her for the good of the colony. Now, this is a man who's looking for a reason to be allowed to marry someone he loves. She's not of his culture, she's not at least of his faith, but she outranks him and your cultures are at war. He has to ask permission of his own governor and her father for them to get married, and both men agree. We're told around the 5th of April, at the church, at the Capitol. This is the church, this is the Capitol. The letter was written by Thomas Dale, the governor, from Jamestown, Virginia, at the top of the letter. He means here. I witnessed the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. And I am telling you, you would be watching that marriage on this spot 401 years ago. It would have happened right here. And what's really happening right now is profound, because half of you would have been Powhatan and half of you would have been English, and you're hoping the killing has stopped. And for 7 years it stops. Why is that important? Because in the 7 years called the Golden Age of Jamestown, peace breaks out. They have a new charter in 1616. No longer are you working for a company for their profit. You're given land to farm for your own profit. An economic system we live under right now. You stop living under martial law, and it's replaced by the common law, which you live under right now to this day. And when this church is replaced by the wooden one over there, you have representative government, which you live under right now. What is the permanence of Jamestown? It is not that tower. It is not that statue. It is you. It is the fact that we all exist today the way we exist. It's the government, language, laws. And they all begin because the Powhatans and English are making a deal as equals. That is profound, because they're partners. But the partnership will not last. And the war will take the place of the peace. And when does the war end? Not until the 1870s. It just keeps pushing west. There's a tragedy and a triumph at the same time. That's the problem with Jamestown. It never lets you off the hook to say everything was great. But it also doesn't say everything is bad. It says that America is very complicated. You just stood where it happened. This is the permanence of Jamestown. This is the argument I'm making. Now let's go to the rest of downtown Jamestown very quickly, and then we'll get in the shade to finish up.